So it's lovely to be here with such a distinguished group of academics, practitioners, and students as well in the field of campaign finance law. Thanks to David for inviting me, and to Valparaiso also for hosting this terrific symposium. This event would be a pleasure under any circumstances, but it's really a delight today, this week, given that the Supreme Court just decided 2 days ago its most important campaign finance decision since Citizens United. So I'm very excited about all of today's panels, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panelists on the third panel will have to say about a decision whose ink is barely dry at this point. So my talk today will be in part about McCutcheon, but I'm going to end with the decision rather than start with it. Instead, I'm going to start with some recent political science findings about the effect of money on our democracy that I think are very important and also very disturbing. And I'll then talk about how these findings illuminate a potential new interest for campaign finance regulations, which I'll call the alignment interest, for aligning public policy with the policy preferences of the median voter. And I'll then explain how the alignment interest is distinct both from the anti-corruption interest that the court has recognized for 40 years now, and also from the equality interest that the court has repeatedly rejected over this period. And then finally, I'll circle back to McCutcheon, in which Justice Breyer's dissent, and even more interestingly, Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, both show more openness to this alignment interest than any prior decisions in the court's history. So, I'm not under any illusions that the current court is looking for new interests to sustain campaign finance regulations, but I still think this openness to alignment is both interesting and important going forward. Let's see if this works. Okay, so what are these political science findings that I think are such a big deal? They fall into 3 categories, which I'll go through in order. Number 1, data on the polarized ideological distribution of campaign donors. Number 2, findings that politicians' voting records and actual public policy outcomes are more consistent with the preferences of the rich than they are with the preferences of the median voter. And number 3, findings that campaign finance regulations directly affect both legislative polarization and the ideological distance between politicians and voters. So let's start with the first category. So political scientists like Joseph Buffumi and Michael Herron, and I borrowed these charts from their work, and Nolan McCarty and Jesse Rhodes and Brian Schaffner, have all found that the ideological distribution of campaign donors is quite bipolar. So these scientists determine the distribution, by the way, by carrying out large end surveys of the American public, which ask about the respondents' policy views, and one of the questions in the survey also asks whether the respondents donated money to a political campaign. So as you can see in the chart on the left, the distribution of all voters in the mid-2000s, that's the line in lighter gray, is barely bipolar. So the 2 peaks that we see are near each other and pretty close to the middle. But in the donor distribution, and that's the line in black, there are quite few people in the middle, and both of the donor peaks are quite far to the left and to the right. So in fact, the donor distribution resembles the distributions of House members and senators, which you can see in the chart on the right, more than it does the distribution of voters. So donors aren't quite as polarized as politicians are. the gap between their peaks is about 2 units rather than 3 on this scale. But they're pretty close in terms of polarization. So the second category of findings come from political scientists like Rose and Schaffner again, Christopher Ellis, Larry Bartels, Marty Gillens, and Patrick Flavin. And they all involve the influence of the rich versus the middle class and the poor on politicians' voting records and on actual policy outcomes. So Rose and Schaffner, Ellis, and Bartels all find that the policy preferences of the rich are a much better predictor of politicians' voting records than are the voting preferences of the middle class or the poor. So in the chart on the left, for example, which is taken from Bartel's work, you can see that in 3 straight Congresses in the 2000s, the views of the poorest third of Americans had essentially no impact. May even have had a negative impact on senators' voting records. Meanwhile, the views of the middle third of Americans, which by definition include the median American, had just a modest impact on senators' votes. And then the views of the richest third of Americans, and this is the group from which almost all campaign donors come, had a much larger impact, almost twice that of the middle group. So the other 2 scholars I mentioned, Gillens and Flavin, they don't look at politicians' voting records, but instead they look at actual policy outcomes. And what they find, if anything, is even more startling. So you can see in the chart on the right, which is taken from Gillens' work, that the odds of a policy being enacted at the federal level don't change at all as support for that policy among people at the 10th percentile for income goes from 10% all the way to 90%. So in other words, the odds of policy enactment are completely non-responsive to the preferences of the poor. Then the odds of enactment are also completely non-responsive to the preferences of median income Americans. So the 50% line in the second chart is also completely flat. But then the odds of a policy being enacted increase steadily as support among people at the 90th income percentile goes from 10% to 90%. So with 10% support among this rich group, there's a 10% chance of policy enactment. But at 90% support, there's a 60% chance of enactment. So these numbers show you the very strong status quo bias of our system, but they also show you how our system's outcomes are systematically biased in favor of the wealthy. Okay, and the final study that I'll mention is by Michael Barber, and he examines the effect that contribution limits, both on individuals and on PACs, have on politicians' voting records. And he confirms the finding that I mentioned earlier, that individual donors are highly polarized. That's the chart on the upper left. Barber also finds, quite interestingly, that PACs that give money are much more centrist in their views. So unlike individual donors, PAC donors aren't polarized at all. And then even more interestingly, Barber finds that the more money that candidates raise from individuals as opposed to PACs, the more extreme the candidates' voting records are. And so that's why the chart on the bottom right, or the bottom left, the line for Democratic candidates slopes downward as they raise a greater share of their money from individuals. And it's also why the line for Republican candidates slopes upward as they raise more money from individuals. So Barber's final and most important finding, unfortunately, doesn't have a pretty chart, but only a regression table for it. So he finds that if you increase individual contribution limits, or get rid of them entirely. Then you enable candidates to raise more money from individual donors whose views, as we've seen, are relatively extreme. And this in turn leads candidates to take more extreme policy stances, so to deviate more from the position of the median voter. And then conversely, if you increase PAC contribution limits or get rid of them entirely, then you enable candidates to raise more money from PACs whose views are relatively moderate. And so this in turn leads candidates to take more moderate policy stances and to move closer to the views of the median voter. So the upshot of all of this is what I think is the first real evidence that campaign finance regulations have an impact on legislative polarization and on the proximity between politicians and voters' positions. So in a nutshell, tighter contribution limits on individuals and laxer contribution limits on PACs both reduce polarization and move politicians closer to the median voter. Okay, so what's the point of all these studies? Well, I think there are 2 points, actually. First, the studies suggest an additional interest that campaign finance regulations can be understood to serve. And then second, the studies also show how awfully far we are from actually achieving that interest today. So the interest I have in mind here is what I call alignment. Having representatives whose policy views align with those of their constituents. More ambitiously, having public policy outcomes that align with what voters want. So the diagram on the left shows you the kind of misalignment that unfortunately is the norm in today's America. We have a median voter with relatively centrist policy preferences, but then we have a representative whose views are much more extreme than those of the median voter. And in large part, that's because, as the studies showed, of the influence of campaign donors on our democratic system with their relatively extreme views. So when you aggregate this district situation up to the level of the entire legislature, by definition, you're going to get severe polarization. And then depending on how the individual districts add up, you can also get a big gulf between the median voter in the whole country and the median member of Congress. So in other words, misalignment at the legislative level to complement our misalignment at the district level. Okay, so what's so good about alignment as a goal? You know, why should alignment be considered a compelling state interest? So one reason is that alignment follows pretty directly from the idea of majoritarianism. So, which is of course the idea that the majority ought to rule. The median voter, by definition, is the voter at the midpoint of the preference distribution. So if the median voter supports something, then necessarily a majority of all voters support that thing too. So to argue for alignment with the preferences of the median voter is really to argue for alignment with the preferences of the majority, which is consistent with how most people understand democracy in the first place. And then a second reason to value alignment is that it's also consistent with a bunch of other democratic theories too. So for example, the father of the US Constitution, James Madison, said that he wanted the House of Representatives to have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. That's really another way of saying that the House ought to be aligned with the people. Similarly, one of the two main models of representation, the delegate model, says that representative ought to comply with the preferences of voters. Hannah Pitkin, for example, wrote that a delegate must do what his principal would do must vote as a majority of his constituents would. In other words, a delegate must align himself with his constituents. Then I can tell a similar story here about other democratic theories like pluralism or minimalism or deliberative democracy. Okay, so let's say I've convinced you that alignment is a legitimate state interest. The obvious question then becomes, how does it relate to the anti-corruption interest that the court has recognized over the last 40 years, or to the equality interest that the court has rejected over this period? Well, if we accept the definition of corruption from McCutcheon most recently, and from Citizens United before it, which is basically limited to quid pro quo corruption, then I think it's pretty clear that alignment is a separate concept. So quid pro quo corruption means giving money to a politician in return for a vote or some other specific favor. Alignment means the congruence of voters and representatives' preferences. They're just entirely unrelated ideas. On the other hand, if we define corruption more broadly, as the court used to, and as many scholars still do, then there is more overlap with alignment. So for example, Larry Lessig recently came up with this notion of dependence corruption, by which he means the situation that arises when politicians are not dependent on voters, as they're supposed to be, but instead are dependent on campaign donors. So saying that politicians are dependent on donors rather than voters isn't all that different from saying that politicians are aligned with donors rather than with voters. Still, I don't think alignment is identical to Lessig's dependence corruption. For one thing, I find dependence to be a very fuzzy term. I don't really know what it means to be dependent on somebody, but whether policy outcomes or policy preferences are aligned is a concrete and quantifiable question. I'm also not sure what the normative significance of dependence is. Why is it so important who exactly politicians are dependent on? On the other hand, the normative significance of alignment follows quite clearly, I think, from the delegate theory of representation and from majoritarianism and from Madison's vision for the House of Representatives. And then also the only kind of dependence corruption that Lessig has in mind is dependence on donors rather than voters. But alignment is a substantially broader concept because you can get misalignment not just through campaign finance policies, but also through restrictions on voters' access to the polls, or through regulations of political parties, or through redistricting, or through internal legislative rules, and the list goes on. So if alignment is not corruption, might it still be the same thing as the equality interest that the court has rejected over and over again? I really don't think so. So first of all, the kinds of equality that the court has said are not permissible governmental goals are the leveling of candidate spending and the leveling of voter influence in elections. So Buckley v. Vallejo famously dealt with both kinds of leveling, and later cases like Davis and Arizona Free Enterprise Club dealt with supposed efforts to equalize candidate spending. Alignment, on the other hand, doesn't say anything about equality of this sort. So it says that voters and representatives' preferences ought to be aligned, not that every candidate ought to spend the same amount, or that every voter ought to contribute the same amount. Now, it is true that equal candidate spending or even more so, equal voter contributions, may promote alignment. But I think it's very important here not to confuse means and ends. So the fact that equality of some sort might be one possible means through which the end of alignment might be achieved, that doesn't make equality the end. It remains the means. So, equality doesn't become the relevant state interest, even if it is conducive to the realization of the actual state interest. And as an example, with respect to contribution limits, we don't say that they're prohibited just because they tend to equalize voters' donations. We recognize that this equalizing aspect of contributions of contribution limits isn't the rationale for the limits, it's just how the actual anti-corruption goal is achieved. And another argument here might be that what I've called misalignment sounds awfully close to the famous line in Austin about the corrosive and distorting effects of immense aggregations of wealth, which the court famously dismissed in Citizens United. But the Austin court never said what those corrosive and distorting effects were. And it certainly didn't say that it had misalignment in mind when it used that language. And both Austin and Citizens United were dealing with the particular problem of corporate wealth and its potential impact on election outcomes. They were not addressing individual wealth and its potential impact on politicians' policy positions, which is how misalignment arises in this area. Okay, so let's say that alignment is not precluded by the court's earlier decisions. Is there any chance the court would actually start using the alignment interest in future cases? I think it's pretty clear that the current court is relentlessly hostile to campaign finance regulations, and there's zero appetite for experimenting with some new interest that could be used to sustain regulations instead of to invalidate them. That being said, there is language both in earlier court decisions and, interestingly, in McCutcheon itself that sounds clearly, to my ear at least, in the register of alignment. And so with a shift in the court's membership, it would not be hard in a future case for a court to conclude that its decisions had already recognized the normative significance of alignment. So the first time the full court, as opposed to individual justices, said positive things about something that sounds like alignment was in Nixon v. Shrink, Missouri in 2000. So Justice Souter wrote the court's opinion in that case, and he upheld Missouri's contribution limits. And he wrote that one of the interests that the contribution limits served was addressing the, quote, broader threat from politicians too compliant with the wishes of large contributors. So politicians that are too compliant with the wishes of large contributors are not compliant enough, they're not aligned enough with the wishes of voters. More significantly, in McConnell v. FEC in 2003, the court upheld Congress's ban on soft money contributions, in part because of the danger that these contributions would cause office holders to decide issues not on the merits or the desires of their constituencies, but according to the wishes of those who have made large financial contributions valued by the office holder. So the danger, in other words, was that soft money contributions would cause office holders to align with the wishes of donors rather than with the desires of their constituencies, as the court put it. So it's not too surprising that the court said positive things about alignment in 2000 or in 2003. That was the court's most pro-regulatory period in recent years. What is very surprising is that in McCutcheon, of all places, Chief Justice Roberts, of all people, basically ended his opinion with what I consider to be a sort of love letter to alignment. So he wrote that for the past 40 years, our campaign finance jurisprudence has focused on the need to preserve authority for the government to combat corruption without, at the same time, compromising the political responsiveness at the heart of the democratic process. Next, Roberts quoted Edmund Burke for the proposition that a representative's judgment should be informed by the strictest union, the closest correspondence, and the most unreserved communication with his constituents. And then Roberts closed by saying that representatives are not to follow constituent orders, but can be expected to be cognizant of and responsive to those concerns. Such responsiveness is key to the very concept of self-governance through elected officials. So the kind of responsiveness that Roberts has in mind here might be different from alignment as I've described the term. Roberts might be referring to responsiveness to the money that voters contribute, since that's what McCutcheon is all about, not responsiveness to voters' policy preferences, let alone responsiveness to the median voters' preferences. Still, the language that Roberts chose to use is very broad. It's very susceptible to multiple interpretations, and it would be very easy for a future court to cite it for the proposition that alignment already has been recognized as a compelling state interest. After all, if alignment is at the heart of the democratic process, and if it's key to the very concept of self-governance through elected officials, then I think it has to be a legitimate governmental role. Okay, and the final issue I'll touch on before closing is what campaign finance doctrine might actually look like if alignment were used as the government's interest instead of anti-corruption. So first, I think contribution limits would continue to be upheld, although I should caveat that they're not necessarily going to be upheld under the anti-corruption interest after McCutcheon. But the reasoning for upholding contribution limits under an alignment approach would not be that they prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption. Instead, the logic would be that contribution limits reduce the likelihood of politicians aligning with their donors rather than with their voters. So I mentioned earlier, there's good empirical evidence that at present, politicians are better aligned with their donors than with their voters. And there's also evidence that contribution limits have a significant impact on alignment. So I think it would be relatively easy in a case to demonstrate the link between tighter contribution limits and an improvement in alignment. Second, I think limits on independent expenditures, which are unconstitutional under current law, also could be upheld under an alignment approach. So the logic would be exactly the same as for contribution limits. Independent expenditures cause politicians to align with the spenders rather than with voters, and they can therefore be limited in order to promote alignment. The main trouble with this sort of argument would be evidentiary. So since we don't currently have expenditure limits anywhere in America, it's really hard to prove that their impact would actually be aligning. But scholars could potentially study the corporate spending bans that were in effect prior to Citizens United. And they could also study foreign countries that have spending limits in effect. On the other hand, I don't think limits on candidate spending, as opposed to outside spending, could be upheld under an alignment approach. So when a candidate massively outspends his opponent, it might be the case that the election outcome is changed from what it would have been under conditions of more even spending. But an imbalance in spending doesn't have any necessary connection to the level of alignment between the winning candidate and the median voter. You know, a candidate can spend a lot more than his opponent and then just as easily be aligned or misaligned with the median voter. And then finally, I think public financing systems would be clearly constitutional under an alignment approach. They reduce the need for candidates to fundraise, and so that in turn reduces the risk that politicians will align themselves with donors rather than with voters. And whether public financing systems actually have this aligning effect can be studied empirically by comparing states that have public financing systems to states that don't. But note that the alignment approach would not uphold systems with triggers like the ones in Arizona Free Enterprise Club or Davis. So the point of a trigger is to equalize candidate spending, not to end the need for candidates to fundraise. So I don't think a trigger mechanism serves the goal of alignment as I've described it. Okay, so I'll stop there. I want to thank you for indulging me as I laid out this sort of pie-in-the-sky vision of what campaign finance law could look like instead of the dismal status quo that we're living under. Again, I'm under no illusions that the current court is going to embrace the alignment approach anytime soon. But my hope is that I've convinced you that the alignment approach is at least a viable option that's left open by existing case law, and that a future court might decide, at some point down the road to adopt. So thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest.